Welcome to the mydy.link podcast. I'm Abla, I'm a film programmer, and my co-host, Coco Green. Hello.
Hello.
This week, we'll also be joined by a guest. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on. My name is Pablo Navarrete. I'm a journalist, independent journalist and documentary filmmaker, normally focusing on Latin American issues, but with a new documentary on Julian Assange's father and the struggle for the freedom of Julian Assange.
Thank you very much. So our focus this week will be on Pablo's work, specifically No Extradition, his latest film. Just before we do that, quick intro, as usual, we'll talk about it's only going to be me this week, actually. I'm going to talk about my picks of the week and mention a couple of festivals. So I'm going to talk about the festivals first, because I'm going to do quite a smooth transition from one of my picks and on to No Extradition. So first of all, I'd like to flag the Deauville Film Festival. It's the American Film Festival of Deauville in France. It's quite a long-running festival. Now, the interesting thing this year, as one of the producers tells me, is that they don't really have any American guests because of Corona. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to go and who they're having in the end, who will turn up. But they have quite an important heritage section. So they'll be showing older films, such as David Fincher's The Game or Paul Verhoeven's Total Recall. There's a celebration of Kirk Douglas films. And a few new films. There's Jonathan Nossiter's latest, Last Words. So that will be running from the 4th to the 13th of September, and that will be live. So that will actually be taking place in Deauville. The other one I'd like to mention, so that's a recommendation flagged by Film Fest Report, our partner. So there's the White Deer International Film Festival. That's running from the 5th to the 13th of September. That's in Britain. But this year it will be running digitally. It's completely free to watch the films. And it mostly focuses on early filmmakers, and it offers the winners the opportunity to share their experiences on its podcast and social channels. So a little bit like what Emerging Filmmakers Night, for example, does. So that's a nice one to check out. There's the Open City Documentary Film Festival as well, and that's running from the 9th to the 15th of September, and that will also be online. And that usually, like every year, they celebrate the art of non-fiction, and they'll have about 30 documentaries followed by Q&As for you to watch. There'll be special events, industry panels and talks. Specifically, there'll be a masterclass with Congolese documentary filmmaker Diodo Hamadi. So he is the director of the recent film The Billion Road, which was named the 2020 official selection of the Cannes Film Festival and the Expanded Realities exhibition. So you'll find more info about these two festivals on the Film Fest Report website. They'll be covering the festivals. They'll probably be hosting interviews and so on, as they've got press accreditation. And the last one I want to talk about is the Australian International Muslim Film Festival, and that runs from the 5th to the 19th of September. And that's been running for a couple of years, and it's an international film showcasing films from all the countries with a majority Muslim population, or any films that touch on issues around Islam. So two films that I'd like to flag. One is a Palestinian short, Maradona's Legs, by Firas Khouri. And that's about two Palestinian boys during the 1990 World Cup who are looking for the so-called Maradona's legs, which are actually a piece of missing sticker that they need to complete a set and win a free Atari. It's a really, really good short. And there's the Gaza One Football One Leg by Patrice Forget. So he's a French filmmaker, and that's about a football game between a French team and a team from Gaza who are all they're all amputees, basically. So it's a really sweet film. So that's it for festival recommendations. I just want to flag as well a really good series on Netflix. It's called Dirty Money, and each episode it's investigative documentaries, really. Each episode focuses on a specific subject.
And they're all really good. I've seen them all. So
You've seen them all?
Oh,
right.
Yeah,
well, I really
really
like
good.
the Kushner one about Jared Kushner and his property empire, which I saw quite recently. But the one I wanted to talk about more specifically this time was the one about Formosa in Taiwan. It's a Taiwanese company that manufactures what they call pellets, plastic pellets, that they sell on to other companies that make plastic components. So this company, Formosa, open up a plant in a small town in Texas, and they sell it to the residents and to the authorities there as a means to create jobs and opportunities for the local community. And obviously they end up polluting the waters and creating massive environmental damage. And why I think it's quite interesting to mention here is because one of the workers at the plant becomes a whistleblower because he exposes the plant's malpractice and their borderline like criminal activities. But he actually becomes a pariah in the town because many residents see it as him jeopardizing their jobs, because so many people from the town are employees of the plant. So if he jeopardizes the plant's operation, then they end up unemployed. I thought it was quite interesting to mention that specific aspect of the fallout of whistleblowing. So that's Dirty Money. It's on Netflix and it's directed by... No, it's not. It's one of the executive producers is Alex Gibney. He made Going Clear, which is the documentary about Scientology, which is really good. We can move on to Pablo's work. So Pablo, you have a new film out, which is No Extradition. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about it and about how it came about and about your meeting with Julian Assange's father.
Thanks again for having me on. So No Extradition is a 35-minute short documentary composed of just some 5 scenes, essentially, 3 with Julian Assange's dad, John Shipton, at different protests outside Belmarsh prison, at an event where Julian is given a journalism prize, at a concert organised by the Don't Extradite Assange campaign in the UK, where MIA performed and he spoke at, and then an interview by a journalist called Mohammed El Mazi, who one of the few journalists has been kind of really following this story, an interview that Mohammed does with John on the train on the way for another trip to visit Julian in Belmarsh. And in between, there are 2 scenes that are put in. One is an event that was held in a church in central London where a lot of people spoke. John Pilger, Lowkey, the UK Iraqi hip-hop artist, Mark Curtis, Lisa Longstaff, Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. And so it's a scene where we take some of the interventions there and we take, I think, 4 people and just provide a kind of little summary of that. And then we have a scene of a protest outside the Magistrates Court in Westminster, where a lot of the kind of hearings post Julian being imprisoned in April 2009 took place. So it was shortly after that. And basically this film came about because I'd been filming some of these protests for Telesur, English and Spanish. Telesur is a pan-Latin American channel based in Venezuela and in Quito for the English channel. I'd been covering as a correspondent for those channels, or for that channel, for both languages. And I was put in touch with Julian's father through John Pilger, the Australian documentary filmmaker and journalist who I worked with in 2005. I was living in Venezuela and I was a Venezuela researcher for his film The War on Democracy, which is on Vimeo, so if anyone's interested in that. It's a documentary, a feature length that explores the US interventions in Latin America and focuses, I guess, the film focuses on Venezuela. And at that time, there was Hugo Chavez was the president, and it was arguably the high point of this pink tide movement in Latin America of left-wing governments. So yeah, I got in touch with John. John put me in touch with John Shipton, Julian's dad. I interviewed him, and I just was struck by... I guess I was struck with him because of his very soft-spoken man, but also with this kind of fierce determination to sort of free his son. I'm not pretending that I'm kind of neutral to the issue. I very much think that what's happening to Julian Assange is an outrage. I think Julian Assange is a political prisoner of the British government at the behest of the US government. I think this has happened to him because he exposed US war crimes, and I think the fact that he could be extradited to the US to face 175 years after already being, essentially having to be forced to stay in the Ecuadorian embassy for close to 10 years and then being pulled out by, illegally almost, and held in a high security prison now in Belmarsh. I think all of that is just an outrage that can happen to someone for exposing war crimes. So yeah, that's probably quite a long answer, but that's how the film came about, and that's the backdrop to it.
Were these all disparate sections that you'd filmed for Telesur, and then you brought them together, you collated them, and then you edit them together? Is that how it worked?
So I'd filmed a number of protests already, maybe like 10 different instances, and it was only really after I interviewed John Shipton, I kind of lost track of the time, but roughly I think around August 2019, so only like close to a year ago, that I kind of just, I kind of thought, that I wanted to do something, make a film. I had a lot of other work on, so I didn't have that much time. And then I thought, how would this work as a film? And I just thought maybe I just need to spend a few filming days with John, and it ended up being just 3. And then I just decided that rather than, try and do just a thing with John, I wanted to also balance that, which was for me as a documentary filmmaker, I guess I started making films. I made the first film in 2009. It was released. I filmed it in December 2008, and that was a more traditional sort of VO, sort of archive, a bit of history, a bit of sort of windows of observation. But the film prior to this one was made with Tyler Vellicott, called Truth, and it looks at the women of the FARC guerrilla, the Colombian guerrilla movement in Havana on the eve of them signing peace accords, and the fact that there was a subcommittee of gender subcommittee that they'd created, and so that was my first observational film, I guess, and I kind of decided that I wanted to carry on that style. And so, I basically thought, well, look, I've got these really quite historic bits of filming from, the magistrate's court. And then I decided just to try and do something that balanced John and this other side, which I also thought was important, because I think there was this kind of very small grassroots campaign that, were ignored by the mainstream media, composed of a number of very dedicated sort of activists who, were doing whatever they could to give prominence to Julian's case, and go outside Belmarsh every weekend and go outside the Ecuadorian embassy when he was there. And I just felt that this was also an important thing that should be highlighted, and I kind of wanted to give that kind of context, as well as spending having a bit of time with John and just exploring John a bit more as a father, and what was kind of driving him to sort of advocate for his son.
So before I ask you, because I did have some questions about John, but for the base of activism, is that journalist or political activist or international? Like, how would you describe the makeup or the character of that activist groundswell? Or if it's international, but the ones that were featured in your film. So it was a variety of activists it looked like, and of course there was a woman who spoke who was a former political prisoner herself. So how would you characterize that?
I mean, that woman is my mum, actually.
No, stop! No.
Yeah. That woman's my mum. So that's. I guess I didn't. Yeah, that was quite a big omission. I mean, my mum has been part of that group of sort of activists. I mean, there are others. Like I would say that I think to be fair, that have been more dedicated. Like there are those that have not missed any. Like every weekend, every time there was a thing. I think my mum's been quite prominent. She's gone to a lot of them, and she's a former. The fact that my name is Pablo Navarrete and speak with an English accent isn't. Yeah. It's because my parents were forced to leave Chile in 1975, 1976, separately, and they had political asylum in the UK, and I was subsequently born here because they were both they spent time in concentration camps after the coup in Chile in 1973 on 9/11, 1973, a US-backed coup, and they, like many, were imprisoned, tortured, and eventually they were lucky, they managed to get out of the country. And so my mum has been quite early on felt very strongly that what's taking place with Julian is a massive injustice. And, I do too, and she's been very much part of that. And so, that speech she gave, I filmed it. It didn't come out ever. I just filmed it, and it was a kind of a last minute inclusion in the film, but I'm glad I did, because I think a lot of people have been it sort of seems to have made an impact with quite a few people in terms of what she says, and it brings I mean, up to now, all my work basically has been, documentary-wise, has been on Latin America. And so this is the first project that isn't really, isn't about Latin America per se, although obviously there is a link to Ecuador, given, Ecuador's role in providing political asylum, and also, and the fact is that many of the activists, and we're talking like, 20, 25, 30, these are the kind of numbers that were coming out, a good 30%, 25% were Latin American. And I think that was like revealing. And I think, I think there are reasons for that. People like my mum, other Latin Americans. And so, yeah, I mean, the question was, who were these people? They were just, my mum was a scientist until last year when she retired. She was quite a senior scientist, and ran part of, or was in charge of part of the National Blood Service. But she, on her weekends, and went out to Belmarsh sometimes, went out to the Ecuadorian embassy, and all these people, most of them have jobs and just feel that what's happening to Julian is an outrage, and go out and protest about it, and ignored by obviously the mainstream, and almost denigrate, almost kind of mocked, spoken of as kind of oddballs or whatever sometimes. So, I would say they're just kind of normal people that feel that there's an injustice being done. And sometimes that word activist, I kind of feel that it's often used very selectively towards people that are of the left, or doing, when people march in favour of Brexit or against it, I don't really hear, people talking about them as activists, where, they're also advocating for something that they feel. So I think whenever someone comes out to protest something that they feel strongly about, I guess they become an activist. But these are just people that are part of society, and for whatever reason feel strongly about that issue.
It just made me, because if we're talking about the actions of the supporters and the campaigners and people just coming out and trying their best to highlight these issues. What are you hoping to achieve by putting this documentary out there? Because as we saw, even in a very kind of quite basic instance of whistleblowing, which is the documentary I mentioned about the worker at the Formosa plant that denounced malpractice, he was completely ostracised by his community, that the consequences were dire for him, and they tend to be for most whistleblowers, which is why it's such a courageous thing to do, but they do it at immense risk to themselves. And the problem is, and I found that with Assange, I found that with Edward Snowden as well, is they've gone through all this effort, they've put their livelihoods at risk, they've lost so much, and yet in the grand scheme of things, a lot of people either know this already and don't care, or simply don't care, or they're up against a media system that will cover up as much as they can. So I feel like, what would you say, what can these campaigners do? What can people putting the message out there and highlighting these issues, what can they do to reach a wider audience?
And to piggyback, Abla, just because I had a similar question about the timing, because in terms of, your question about what the aims were, I was wondering too about the timing of that, because I know the upcoming, trial's forthcoming. But I hate to do double barrel questions, but just to keep that in mind, it's fine.
Okay, I mean, I think when I made the film, I did want for it to come out before, on Monday, the 7th of September, the sort of last, in theory, phase of the extradition trial begins. So I wanted this film to come out before this process began now on the 7th of September. And I had a number of other projects I was finishing. And so in a way, I would have liked to have more time to even get do a crowdfunding campaign. I mean, I've got children, I live in London. I kind of said to myself, the first film I ever did, and I came into documentary filmmaking without any, I never went to film school. I guess I came at it from independent journalism after living in Venezuela, working with John Peel on this feature length, and working with but they were more news journalists, videographers. It interested me, the idea of sort of storytelling through documentary. And I did say, I can't make these kind of films irresponsibly, financially. but I did because I kind of was so compelled to just do it, and I said, look, I'll sort the rest out after. So I did want it to come out before because I thought I thought it was important for people to sort of see this film before September or during, while the case is going on. And in terms of the whistle, I mean, there is also actually a film. Curiously, I didn't even know this until a week before the film was going to be premiered. It had already been announced, and Julian's dad told me that he was being part of another film being made by a feature length, also called Father the Movie, about his kind of his journey, what he's doing. But they're here now in London filming, a bigger production that's going to take in the whole trial and everything, and will be out next year. So I'm happy that this is a shorter film and it's come out now, because I think it would have been a bit unfortunate to have two films sort of covering the same ground. And I think my film is, it's kind of different to what the other stuff that I've seen out there on Julian. There's been some really excellent sort of more archive-based, talking heads-based films done by sort of news channels, and but this was this is quite a simple sort of get to the sort of humanity of John as a dad, as a human being, and then the rest was sort of quite simple observational stuff. In terms of the whistleblowing, I mean I think we have to also slightly separate the whistleblowers, which in this case would be Chelsea Manning. I saw a really good film actually. Well, I thought it was pretty good because I haven't actually seen that many films recently. But Official Secrets, I saw it on. Well, I'm going to advertise it, but I saw it. I think it's a 2019 film by about the GCHQ, which is the British
Catherine,
Catherine Gunn, I think, or Gunn, yeah. The story of and it's Keira Knightley plays Catherine Gunn, a British intelligence. And she's a whistleblower, and it's a real case. And I found that to be a interesting and kind of well-made film. And so, people like Catherine Gunn, people like Chelsea Manning, people like Edward Snowden, the whistleblowers, obviously. But Julian is slightly different. And I think that's what's been very effective in a way, is how, this kind of feeds into what I would argue has been the very effective demonization of Julian Assange by a range of interests, I guess, in that Julian Assange is essentially a publisher. I mean, WikiLeaks have got 100%, record in terms of, correct information. They worked with, a range of media in publishing a number of their leaks. And so he's essentially a journalist and a publisher. And he's not the whistleblower. He's the person that worked with the whistleblower to reveal. And so what's happened now is that the precedent that has been set is that a journalist of a country, Australia, has been arrested in the UK for exposing war crimes of the US. And so that precedent is horrific for any journalist. The fact that it's not front page news, I think, is really quite revealing, and I think we really need to unpack why that's the case. I mean, my argument is that the UK media they have not only not reported this case fairly, but they have been at the forefront of smearing Julian Assange, the case. They've misrepresented the facts, and I think they've been at the forefront of demonizing, which has contributed to probably the lack of sympathy that he has generally in the population. I think this is changing. I think there is, at least in terms of bodies such as Amnesty, Reporters Without Borders, the National Union of Journalists, increasingly there are bodies who are increasingly kind of vocal about what's at stake here. But I think that and obviously we can't forget the accusations of, there were never actually charges. There weren't even charges. There were accusations around sexual assault charges. And the more I read about how these were handled in terms of the British judiciary, the guy who is now head of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, was head of the Crown Prosecution Service. And if you look at the emails from the Crown Prosecution Service to the Swedish judiciary telling them not to back out of this, I mean, it does raise a lot of suspicion about what was really going on here, and to what extent these were, genuine, accusations, and the fact that they weren't processed in the regular manner, they were processed in highly irregular ways, really lead to many just to say that this is a part of the political persecution and was done to take away support. Because I know for a fact that many people on the left who initially sympathised with Assange stopped basically after all this.
As soon as
said,
that came out.
Said, look, I kind of have sympathy for him, but you're not going to, I can't defend a rape.
Well, that's why I thought it was interesting that you had one of the representatives from Women Against Rape speak at that meeting in the church and talked about the way the allegations were handled.
The fact that someone like Lisa Longstaff has not been interviewed in, I've never seen an interview with her in The Guardian. I've never seen an interview with her on the BBC. And, she's damning about what from an organisation called Women Against Rape, she's damning about what she feels and the organisation feels is what is behind these allegations. Got the sense that there was almost this this kind of narrative that it was all like men who sort of minimised sort of rape, or it was a really kind of disturbing sort of narrative that was imposed. As, it was like you're not really defending Julian, are you? Everyone knows he's a rapist, isn't he? That kind of anyone that knows the behaviour of the US and British security services wouldn't be surprised at all if there was something sort of created around that. And perhaps that's why more Latin Americans were willing to sort of look into this, say, something looks a bit irregular here.
They're used to that kind of thing happening.
Well, I mean, Latin Americans understand what US imperialism does when it wants to, eliminate, be it a government, a movement, an individual. And so, this kind of benefit of the doubt, saying, oh no, but it's, in the end, it was completely the case that the US wanted to extradite him for his publishing of war crimes. But it was all sold and on another. It was like, no, this has nothing to do with the US. This is all about these very serious charges of rape, basically, that they were saying, which was not the case. Yeah, I mean, I think this film doesn't go into all of that, but it just tries to provide the feelings of a father, the feelings of a group of people that are defending Julian, many of which are women, including my mum, people who have suffered the brunt of, who have been political prisoners. And I think it's made the people that have watched it, I've heard comments that it's certainly made people think, and especially, you talk about the intervention by Lisa Longstaff and Women Against Rape. I mean, I was struck when I was at that event. I mean, it was a very powerful speech. And I think it really hits home with a lot of people.
So is that what you're trying to do, is amplify these unheard voices that are clearly strong voices if you are to attend any sort of rally of support, and then also to reframe the narrative away from Julian as an individual to the broader story about, as you're saying, U.S. imperialism or trying to, stamp out any sort of social movement? I mean, do you feel like that's part of this, his story is part of a broader social movement around freedom of speech or holding empires to account? What would you say is the...
I have to be very upfront that, I have a problem with the dominant media, the narratives that they impose. I think that there is a very striking correlation between who's a baddie and who's a goodie for the Western media, and who's a baddie and a goodie for Western governments. And so I think that's a very unhealthy correlation that we see. I've lived in Venezuela during the Chavez years. I've done documentaries in Colombia. I know that Venezuela and Colombia have lived very different experiences, yet for the Western media, Colombia would probably be a relative success story, and Venezuela would be, even though Venezuela today is suffering very real. I mean, I have Venezuelan family. I know what's going on there. But if you look at Colombia and Venezuela, and you look at the media reporting of both of those countries for the last 20 years, I think you'll get an insight into what I would argue are the very real problems with the mainstream media. And so my journalism, my documentary filmmaking has always tried, has always challenged, the dominant narrative. In that sense, this film feeds into that. And I guess in the sense that it's an observational film, I've seen some great observational films, and even the ones that I've thought were great technically and powerful and emotional, I sometimes had very real problems with their lack of sort of context. The fact that whilst they were effective, powerful, in terms of the micro, I thought that by not illuminating any macro or any context, they also left you a little bit none the wiser as to why things happen, why. And I think that's the critique I would have of much of Western journalism as well. There's this absolute focus on the individual, and I think that's, if it's not done on purpose, it's a kind of subconscious lack of structure, of context that is given to people, and that's why people don't, they put like Chavez was this kind of populist army general that kind of just arrived, and it was almost like that he was tricking the Venezuelans, the poor Venezuelans, uneducated, into voting for him election after election, and there was no context to the fact that Venezuela had higher inequality than South Africa at the time of his election, that poverty was 55%, that people, and so this lack of kind of context really is very useful for a lot of people in terms of minimizing the agency of individuals in collective struggle. Yeah, I'm always sort of seeking to be able to platform that collectivity. And so, yeah, it's a learning curve for me as a filmmaker as well. But I'm certainly aware of the things which I'm not, which I find a bit problematic in the observational filmmaking that I've seen.
Sakura, you had a question about John Shipton specifically, didn't you?
Yes, no. So I thought that was interesting about trying to capture his sense of, duty and family and fatherhood, and trying to really frame his devotion to it, not only in his admiration for what he did, but also just as a father. So I just wondered if that was something you were trying to capture, the meaning of fatherhood and family and duty, that it's not just about, when he's in prison, that even process of being a political, as you're framing it, as a political prisoner, but that you really do kind of imprison the family and it becomes a family fight as well. So I just wanted to know what you were trying to portray.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any father who has a son in prison, I imagine who felt that there was a kind of gross miscarriage of justice, I think would be compelled to do something. Obviously, John has left Australia for large sections of time to come to the UK. When he was interviewed by Mohammed, this journalist, at the end, and it was there was a kind of personal question asked about how he felt as a father, and he gives that quite emotional response. It's almost like determination to free his son, becomes even greater once he feels, because of the level of injustice. Yeah, I felt that was important. We end on that kind of on those lines, because at the root, yes, there is this noble fight. There was a kind of collectivity that feels outraged. There's a global movement trying their best to save Julian's life. He's already, in health-wise, he's by all accounts not in a good state. Yeah, obviously, I think it's most simple. This is a struggle of a father trying to save his son's life, but it's also so much more than that.
I'm always curious about those things because it relates somewhat to what you were saying about providing context, because I find that that's what's lacking in order to be able to understand those stories, whether or not you agree with your perspective on it, but even to be able to digest it and analyze it, you have to have some sort of political education. And even when we think about how the narratives are framed as the individual, that's always a problem, because people are always situated in families, right? So always in institutions, and that's kind of the most obvious one, is you're always situated in a family. So it's even a problem to talk about the individual without understanding that context of the family, like what's intergenerational about their life, what's inherited, what will they be passing down, the sort of legacies there. So that's why I was asking about the father.
That's really interesting, actually. The immediate context is the family before it's the society you live in. That's where the structural issues come from. But that's, to be honest, that's the whole issue with the lack of long form journalism. There's very little critical analysis, and there's very little space for that to give you a genuine structural perspective on things.
I mean, I've said it on many occasions, and people are just like, okay, can you stop talking about this? But, I lived in Venezuela. The Guardian sent their first correspondent in 20 years or so to be the Latin American correspondent, and the person didn't even speak Spanish. He lived in the richest part of Caracas with the kind of quote unquote expats or whatever. and his journalism, made no attempt to have. There is, this guy. There was financing there for him to provide, even if it was, hostile journalism towards the government. There could have been context. It was just very lazy, very much, about the individual, sort of almost mocking it. I mean, and then there's this other thing, obviously the Western press, and I think the Western left are also. I mean, I'm born here, so I don't want to be too, but there is also this kind of slight imperial mindset that permeates all sections of society in countries such as the UK, that kind of feel that are these kind of colourful, kind of these kind of slightly, mocking but euphemisms, like the colourful character, or like these kind of corrupt dictators, or almost and the fact that many people feel that they have that they can sort of lecture many of these countries, the sort of darker skinned, how they should carry out their revolutions. Or
well, there's a journalist, Chris Hedges, that makes a similar observation about that foreign correspondence, that's the cushiest job you can get, because like you're saying, you described it as lazy journalism. He's like, you don't have to do much, you just can kind of repeat what comes across in Associated Press, and you get a very cushy lifestyle. So
I come from a left-wing political family, and when I went to live in Venezuela in 2005, I studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, a very left-wing. I studied economics there. I was I was hardly, I think, too naive about kind of the establishment and what U.S. imperialism. But when I went to live in Venezuela, I thought the Guardian was a left-wing newspaper, and I took its journalism seriously. But after seeing the kind of just absolute sort of superficiality with which it dealt, almost like reckless, and I kind of thought, imagine the contempt that they have towards their readers to send someone to the country who doesn't, to be their first correspondent in 20-something years, who doesn't even speak the language, and who lives in a penthouse in the richest part of the of the capital. It's almost like I don't know, I just find it very almost disrespectful to their readers, and it made me think, that's their Latin America correspondent. Why should I trust what their Africa correspondent or their Asia correspondent or any correspondent writes?
Well, no, I think it's a very interesting point, and also allows me to move swiftly on to another point I wanted to discuss with you, which was one of your previous films, Hip Hop Revolucion.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a big hip hop fan, for want of a better word, and I watched it and I really enjoyed it. And for those who don't know it, it's a documentary about hip hop schools, I guess, in Venezuela, where young people are taught hip hop alongside politics. So I just want to know a bit more about how that came about, and I'm mostly curious to see what your perspective on this is, since this was shot a few years ago. So given what's happened since in Venezuela, where do these hip hop schools fit now?
Yeah, that film, to be honest, hadn't really been shown nearly as much as it should have been, and that's my fault. Basically, I went to Venezuela with Jody McIntyre, who was a young activist with cerebral palsy, and I met him, quite an inspirational person. And then I went also with his friend Lowkey, the UK Iraqi hip hop artist. Some of you might know, political, I guess, rapper. And we spent some time with the Hip Hop Revolucion collective, who were political hip hop collective, supportive of the government, but also very militant. And in no way could they be said to be a kind of government. I mean, they supported Chavez and the movement, but they were. The reason I actually made this film was because my first ever film was called Inside the Revolution. I made it after living in Venezuela, coming back, and deciding, that I wanted to make something about my experience. And in that film, there's a small bit of archive that I use about a performance that some of the Hip Hop Revolution people did on El Presidente, which was Hugo Chavez's Sunday sort of weekly show, where he, sometimes it was hours long, where sometimes he sang, but basically he was telling the Venezuelan people what his government was doing and what he was doing. And I think they were invited on to sing a song that they had done, celebrating the fact that the coup against Chavez in 2002. Yeah, I think it was 2001, 2002. That lasted 48 hours and was eventually overturned. And that was a song about that. But then in that bit of archive, and this film is actually on the Alvarado Films Vimeo. It's free to watch. My first film. They decided to just do an impromptu rap about the deficiencies of the bureaucracy, of the government bureaucracy. So, which I thought was really brave, and I think it was very much. I mean, I'm a hip hop fan as well, so the fact that they did that, and I thought it kind of very much spoke to the spirit of rebellion. Even a hip hop group that were supporting the government were sort of so militant that they were just rapping against government bureaucracy in front of the whole country, in front of the president. And it was funny because I showed that film in a number of places in the US shortly after it came out in 2009. That December I went and I showed it at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and a lot of the students there, like in the Q&A, they were asking whether they were now in prison, if these guys were now in prison for having rapped like that in front of the president. And I was just like struck because they were. I mean, at the time, obviously that was spoke about to the idea that they had of what was happening in Venezuela, and almost like any dissent would mean you'd go to prison like that. But yeah, I mean, I decided that if I ever made something again about Venezuela, that I'd try and make it with these guys, and yeah, I found them inspirational. As to what they're doing now, I mean, that was in 2011, when nearly 10 years later, the situation in Venezuela has got much more complicated for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons that's almost never spoken about is the sort of quite severe US sanctions against the country. I mean, again, we're in Britain and hardly anyone in the media speaks about the $1 billion worth of, actually I read recently that could be even twice that, so $2 billion worth of gold that the Bank of England has basically decided to steal off the government. But things are difficult in Venezuela. So these guys, it is not the case that these schools are still going on. A lot of these activists have left. Some have left the country, some are doing different things. I haven't really followed what's going on, but I know that that reality doesn't exist anymore. And that when I filmed 2011, it wasn't the high point. The high point of what I guess the Venezuelan process under Chavez and Maduro was under Chavez around the time I lived there, 2005, 2006. 2011 was tough, but Chavez was still alive. People knew he was ill. Things were getting tougher, but it's not like it was now. And it would be interesting to go now to Venezuela and almost do like a follow-up with all these young activists to see what they're doing now and what role hip hop still has. And I also found it interesting to do a film about hip hop, a US coming from the US in the context of Venezuela and arguably the most anti-US government. I mean, a process that was challenging US domination of the region. And I just found that kind of interesting as well.
So we've touched on your filmmaking processes and your career path, I guess, as a filmmaker throughout. How did you manage to get the projects off the ground? How did you manage to secure funding? How did you just self-fund throughout? How did you set up a production company for it?
That first film I just made, like literally I bought the cheapest camera that I thought was acceptable, and a friend of mine who was kind of wanting to learn about camera said, okay, I'll come out. And then, it was very low budget, and it was almost like quite a reckless going to film school through making a feature documentary. I think there are, with the project I'm working on now, I certainly think I'm going to apply for funding, even though that funding probably is harder to get now. But I certainly think there are more sort of responsible ways of making films, and the funding and all get the grants, the pre-production, post-production grants that you need. I'm not someone that's can speak about that because I've never really really applied to them. But it's not to say that, I want to, and I will do quite, I guess, aggressive in the kind of even that first documentary, there were contacts that allowed me to show it in a number of US universities and get screening fees and then educational life. I've, in that sense, found that the kind of grassroots approach to production and distribution is never going to pay the bills in any significant way, but it will say, it's one way to part fund something. On that US tour, even I was like selling DVDs, and I remember the premiere for the Venezuela film actually was at SARAS, and it was probably because nothing had really come out in Venezuela at that time. But we had, it was a Halili lecture theatre, and I think that fits 140, and I think close to 300 people came for the premiere. It kind of was, and we've sold DVDs even of the film even at the premiere. And so I wouldn't recommend this as the way for any documentary filmmaker per se to make the film. Another thing I would say though that I'm glad I did, even in that first film, is that I spoke to a number of people that worked in documentaries and showed them the rushes. And some of them, are people that have been to film school, and they were like, well, you can't use that, that's overexposed, the sound there is not. And so they kind of eliminated lots of the filming because of the technical sort of issues with it. And then I would look at some of it and go, yeah, but look, this is really like powerful emotionally. And then I had to make a really tough decision as someone with no experience. And in the end, even the archive I mentioned about these, the Hip Hop Revolucion rapping in Chavez, I was told by two people that worked, oh, that's too long. And in the end, and I showed one thing that was overexposed from an activist, and they ended up being the things that people sort of speak most about as the most powerful things in the film. And that showed me very early on, whilst it's great to have technically technically excellent material, I think sometimes people who have been, there's a kind of a focus on aesthetic to the detriment of content. So I think really you want both, but if you have to choose, sometimes maybe content and emotion are kind of key.
I think as a viewer, my main issue is as long as the sound's good, it's okay.
Yeah.
If you can hear what's being said. That's it for us then. Thanks everyone for listening. You can catch us on mydialorama.org.uk, and you can tweet us if you have any questions or comments at mydialorama, and any questions for any of our guests as well, we'll pass them on. Thanks for listening.